Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
The unexplained abound tonight in our little cafe. Tonight I have a whole host of new and scary work stories for you featuring such outrageous terror as giants, reptilians, and, wait for it, really angry grandma ghosts. Oh, you're not prepared for this, my friends. So go grab a Fiber One bar and I'll rustle up some cafe mochas for the both of us. They're on me. Actually, they're half off. These are tales from the break room. I had an unsettling experience working at a plant nursery. From Shab, 1999. I never believed in ghosts or spirits, or any of that supernatural stuff. Growing up in the suburbs outside a mid-sized city in the Midwest, my life had always been grounded in reality. School days came in predictable cycles. Part-time jobs were straightforward. Just the ordinary rhythms of a medium town. I also don't consider myself easily spooked. I mean, I'm the type of person who, if I hear a bump in the night, I figure it's just an old pipe rattling somewhere. Maybe the wind outside. Certainly not the type of person for ghost tours, or ghost hunting for that matter. But then, there was the incident at the nursery. It was about 2 years ago, during a period in my life when I was taking off time from college. I had decided to press pause on my environmental science degree because I just didn't know where I was heading. My boyfriend, Brendan, and I had been seeing each other for about a year, and he supported my choice. But money wasn't exactly pouring in, so I found a job working at a local plant nursery, not too far from our apartment. It was a decent-sized nursery, bigger than the ones you see attached to supermarkets. This place had its own buildings and a large greenhouse that stretched nearly a quarter of an acre behind the main storefront. We sold everything from everyday succulents to ornamental grasses, from hardy Midwest perennials to rarer tropical blooms that had to be coddled in the heated sections of the greenhouse. My shifts usually started in the afternoon, around 2, and I'd close up shop in the evening, around 8 o'clock in the summer, a bit earlier in the fall. The nursery had a parking lot out front, a fenced perimeter, and a sizable connected greenhouse, which hummed quietly with fans and irrigation systems. It smelled like damp earth and green leaves, and that smell was so familiar to me. At first, I loved it. Working there was peaceful. I got to learn about the different plants, which helped cement my interest in botany. I figured if I ever went back to school, maybe I'd shift toward a degree in horticulture or plant sciences, something that gave me purpose. I never did imagine I would have an encounter here that would leave me too terrified to set foot back in the plant nursery again. The first incident happened in late summer. The days were still warm, and the nursery was quieter in the evenings. Brendan had come to hang out as he sometimes did. He would bring me a coffee or a smoothie, and we would chat while I tidied up the place before closing. He'd usually wait out in the car once I started to lock the doors and counting the register. On this particular night, I remember it was just past 7:30, and the sky was that dusky purple, the kind you get right before twilight settles in. Most customers had left by then. I'd flipped the open sign to closed about 15 minutes prior, as I wanted some downtime to put everything in order before I locked up. By that point, there were no lingering shoppers inside. At least, not that I knew of. The greenhouse lights were still on, just buzzing overhead. We kept those on until we left, because we didn't want to stumble in the dark if we had to check something last minute. I was finishing my routine inside the main building, counting receipts, making sure the front door was locked. I could see Brendan's silhouette in the car through the glass doors, just fiddling with his phone. Then suddenly I heard a soft humming sound. At first I thought it might be one of the fans in the greenhouse acting up, making a weird pitch. But as I listened, I realized it was a human voice, a gentle, throaty hum of some old tune I didn't recognize, but which sounded somehow ancient, It was just a few notes, going over and over again. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. Something about that sound. It was so out of place in the silence of closing time. It set me on edge. Then again, sometimes older customers would wander further into the nursery than they realized, drawn to the flowers, never noticing we had closed. It wouldn't be the first time someone had to be gently ushered out at the end of the day. So I followed the sound to the greenhouse. It was dimmer inside than during the day, of course, but the overhead lights were still bright enough to see clearly. The space was large and smelled of moist soil and fertilizer. My footsteps echoed on the cement walkway as I passed rows of potted geraniums, ferns, and marigolds. The humming grew louder as I approached the section where we kept some of the fancier perennials. And then I saw her. An old woman, very elderly by the look of her posture and the silvery bun of hair at the nape of her neck. She stood facing away from me, leaning slightly over a bed of small white flowers. Carnations, I think. She was dressed in a long, old-fashioned dress that looked oddly formal for gardening, like something from decades past. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands seeming to busy themselves among the petals. And she was humming that odd little tune. I started to speak. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. "We're closed for the evening." The old woman didn't react. She just kept humming and moving her hands, as though tending to the blossoms. There was something off about her posture, like she wasn't truly bent with age, but rather contorted unnaturally. I took a step closer. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we've closed for the day. I'll have to ask you to come back tomorrow." I stopped mid-sentence. An overwhelming sense of terror washed over me. It was so sudden, this feeling of pure awfulness and fear sank into my guts. I can't explain it fully. It was as though every instinct screamed at me to get away from her. Don't go near her. I broke out into a cold sweat. My mouth went dry. I could barely swallow. I tried again, but my voice faltered. "Ma'am?" She just kept humming and tending as if I didn't exist. But I knew she knew I was there. Something about the tension in the air told me she was aware of my presence. My mind raced. This was no ordinary late shopper. The feeling in that greenhouse was horrific, like there was hatred flowing through the air. I had never felt such raw fear, especially not without any apparent reason. I backed away slowly at first, then turned and bolted for the door. I was panting as I ran out into the evening air. I remembered the cool dusk feeling like a splash of cold water on my face. I sprinted towards Brendan's car and flung open the passenger door, startling the poor guy. He looked at me wide-eyed. "What's wrong?" he asked. I struggled to say it. There's someone in the greenhouse," I managed. "An old lady. She's not supposed to be in there. I asked her to leave, but..." My words were beginning to tumble out nonsensically. Brendan tried to calm me down. Okay, let's go check." He turned off the engine, got out, and together we walked back inside. I clung to his arm, feeling foolish and frightened at the same time. He was bigger and stronger than me, and I thought surely this would just turn out to be some confused old woman. Maybe I'd overreacted. Inside, the greenhouse was now quiet. Too quiet. The humming was gone. We searched the entire section, row by row. There was no sign of the old woman. I checked the entrances and exits. They were locked as I had left them. No one could have gotten in or out without me noticing. Brendan tried to reassure me that maybe she just slipped out at the front when I was running around the back, but I knew that was impossible. The main doors had been locked, and even if she had somehow sneaked past me, how could an elderly woman move so quickly, so quietly? We left that night with me feeling shaken and confused. Maybe I was imagining things. I wanted to believe that. After all, stress could do strange things to a person. Maybe the dimness of the lights back there and my stress got the better of me. For a few weeks, everything was normal again. I kept working my shifts. Brendan would sometimes stop by, sometimes not. I was still saving my money, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my future. The strange incident began to fade in my memory, though occasionally I did find myself looking over my shoulder while watering the hanging baskets or organizing seedlings. The greenhouse still had the same earthy smell, and the plants remained indifferent to my fears. Then came the second incident. It was early fall by then. The days were getting shorter. The nursery was gearing up to sell mums and decorative pumpkins. This time I was completely alone. Brendan had a shift at his own job and could not stop by. But I did have the car, and after closing I could simply drive myself home. I remember the exact date because it was just after the local fall festival. People had been coming in all week asking for cold, hardy plants. I started my usual closing routine at around 7:45 p.m. I flipped the sign, locked the front door, and headed back to tidy the greenhouse. That's when I heard it again. The humming. The same lilting, ancient tune. My blood ran cold. Every hair on my body stood up. I felt nauseous with fear and dread. I could have walked away. I could have pretended I didn't hear anything, locked the greenhouse, and left. But I couldn't leave, knowing someone, something, was inside. It was my responsibility to ensure the place was empty. The thought of confronting her again alone was petrifying. But I had no choice. I had to know. I moved slowly, cautiously, into the greenhouse. The humming was coming from the same area as before, near the white carnations. I wondered if I would find her in the exact same spot. Sure enough, as I stepped through the rows, I caught sight of the back of her dress again. The old woman was there, humming, leaning over the flowers as though no time had passed since that first night. The exact same posture, the exact same tune. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to speak. "Excuse me," I said, voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. "I don't know who you are, but you can't be here after closing. You need to leave." This time, she stopped humming. She froze, her back still to me, her head slightly bowed. I held my breath. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heart beating in my ears. I waited, but she did not turn. Summoning what courage I had, I took a few hesitant steps closer. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady again. "I'm calling the police if you don't leave right now." At that, a low chuckle emerged from her. It started soft, sounding like a gentle laugh of an amused grandmother, but with each passing second, it deepened, resonating like a man's voice echoing in a cave. The sound reverberated through the greenhouse, making the metal frames and glass panes vibrate a bit. My legs went cold. I could barely stand up straight. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, the old woman began to straighten. She moved so slowly and unnaturally that I let out an involuntary sob. She didn't turn around, though. She just kept laughing, that deep, horrible laugh. It sounded like something inhuman, wearing a human disguise. I didn't wait to see what was coming next. I ran. I turned on my heel and sprinted out of the greenhouse, not daring to look back. I pulled out my keys but dropped them twice due to my panic before finally getting into the car. I rapidly locked the doors. My breath was coming in short, painful gasps. Finally, the headlights burst to life, revealing the now dark parking lot. I pulled away, looking back at the greenhouse one last time before I left. Through the panes, I thought I saw a figure standing in the dark, but I wasn't sure. Didn't want to be sure. That was the last time I encountered her. A few days later, I quit, my excuse being that I wanted to refocus on my studies. But that wasn't entirely a lie. The truth was I couldn't stay there, couldn't face that greenhouse again, not after what I'd experienced. I didn't bother asking coworkers if they'd seen anything. I guess I was terrified of hearing that I was losing my mind, or worse, that others had seen her too. Months passed. I eventually did decide to go back to college, this time focusing more closely on botany. In some ways, those experiences at the nursery pushed me toward a greater interest in plants, as strange as it might sound. Maybe I wanted to rationalize what I'd seen, or maybe I just wanted to ground myself again in the truly natural world, something I could study, understand, and categorize. Actually, I'm due to graduate next year, and I often think back to that nursery. I remember it fondly in some respects. The nice smells, the beautiful plants. Most of the customers were so nice. But I can never erase the memory of that old woman. Working as a nanny in a haunted house. From 0 to 0. I'm not the best at telling or writing stories, so I apologize in advance if it's all over the place. My story starts with a little bit of know-me information. I've had multiple paranormal experiences throughout my life. I'm a 32-year-old female, by the way. A lot of these experiences happened in my 20s. From sleep paralysis to deja vu, premonitions, hearing voices, as well as a psychic looking into me and informing me that I had some kind of psychic power myself. Forgot what the term was, though. It typically comes and goes, and I don't have any control over it. It sort of does what it wants. Anyway, back in my 20s, I was a nanny for this one family for about a year and a half. When I first started working, 2 months in, I always felt weird or odd whenever I looked or walked by the parents' bedroom. This happened every day. I brushed it off, telling myself I'm feeling this way because it's their personal private space. I'm not one to snoop. Now, this feeling didn't occur when the mother invited me in their room. Only when I had no business with the room itself did I get that feeling. One day, I had just put their children at the time, 3 and 4 years old, down for their afternoon nap, and this is usually my time to eat some lunch. While eating, I heard footsteps walk across the floor above me. The parents' room is above the kitchen. I thought one of the kids woke up and forgot what time it was, and wanted to cuddle with their parents for the night. I walked to the stairs and looked up. The parents' bedroom door is at the top of those stairs, which was now slightly ajar. I got this intense feeling of do not enter from it. But, thinking about the girls, I walked up to check if they were still in bed. One of the girls' rooms was beside the parents'. I opened her door and she was sleeping in her bed. Then I walked across the hallway to the other girl's room, opened the door, and she was sleeping in her bed. I thought this was odd, but I went back downstairs. Now, I was thinking perhaps one of them was playing a trick on me, and I would make sure to catch whomever it was if it happened again. I continued my lunch and heard the footsteps walk across the floor, from one end to the other, again. I ran to the stairs, thinking I would catch one of them sneaking back to their bedroom, but the parents' door was in the same place, slightly ajar. I stared at it for some time, absorbing the intense feeling emanating from it. This time, I went up 3 stairs, as it only takes 3 stairs to see all the doors. Both of the girls' doors were closed. I looked at the parents' door now and said, "Nope," and went back to the kitchen. Now, when I arrive at their house, it's 6 a.m. Both parents had already gotten up for work and were waiting upon my arrival to leave. So there's no chance of anyone coming into the house and being in the parents' bedroom. The attic is also only accessible from one of the daughters' rooms. But it's one of those doors where you have to use a ladder and push the wall door upwards to get up. This layout is a typical Canadian house that has no attic but foam and whatever else material for the roof. And it's a crawl space, so you can't even stand up there. I messaged the mother about what just happened. That's when she messaged me everything that was going on. She informed me things have been happening for months and would understand if I no longer wanted to work for them. Her daughters have been waking up every night at 3 a.m., screaming and crying, claiming someone is at the end of their bed, or the person won't stop talking so they can't fall asleep. The youngest and the mother could smell rotten eggs occasionally. She said throughout the night her bed gets kicked, and one time she felt a presence come on the bed, lying down next to her. But when she turned over, no one was there, but there was an indentation in the mattress. Another night, she thought her husband got called in for work, saw him get dressed, and left the room. In the morning, when she went downstairs, she saw her husband waking up on the sofa. She asked him when he got home, and he said he was always home and had simply fallen asleep on the sofa at 11, and she just woke him up. So the mother was confused, as she clearly saw him get dressed for work and leave the room. She then asked the neighbor about the first owner of the house, as that neighbor had lived in her house since it was built. The neighbor said the owner passed away in the place, one of the girls' rooms actually, and had the exact build and frame as her husband. The last story she told me was about how they hired someone to come and level the backyard so they could install a pool properly. She said, "He walked in the house to the back door, paused, and told us he could not do the job because there's a spirit in the house that does not want him here and is upset about all the renovations they've done. He didn't turn around and walk to the front door. No, he walked out from the backyard door, went to the gate, and just left. Didn't want to step foot back inside the house." Upon hearing this, I told her what I knew of the paranormal. And yes, I stayed. I informed her that all I got so far was creepy vibes and hearing footsteps. Nothing physical had happened, so I felt good about it. A couple of weeks went by, and the girls and I were in the basement, playing with small toys. I was against the wall, playing with their black cat in front of me, and the girls were also in front of me, an arm's reach away. While playing, I saw this black shadow mass, the size of a medium dog, zoom from the right to the left, behind them, shrink to nothing at the floor by the wall. I thought I was going crazy, until their cat stopped playing with me, got up, and literally walked to the spot it had disappeared. Again, nope came to my mind, and I told the girls I saw a rat, so we had to go upstairs. Once we were going upstairs, the mother came home, and I told her what just happened. A couple of weeks went by and nothing else happened. The mother asked me at the end of the week if I still got any vibes or anything. I thought for a minute and said no. She said last weekend she had a priest come and bless the house, even saged a whole sage stick until the fire alarms went off. Nothing has happened in the house since that purification. That's my experience of working in a haunted house as a nanny. The Shadow Colossus, from Dogger and Leeroy. I remember that night in detail, even though it's been years and I've tried to convince myself it never really happened, at least not the way I remember. It was late summer 2005, early August maybe, and I was home alone with my 2 dogs. I had just turned 24 a few months before, living back with my dad at our property in upstate New York. The place was a bit isolated, semi-rural, surrounded by patches of old farmland and thick woods. We had this long dirt driveway, about 150 yards in length, that ran from the house to a narrow 2-lane road, which wound around the outskirts of a sizable wooded area. Usually, you could see the faint glow of distant city lights beyond those trees, if you peered through certain gaps between the branches. It was around 10 p.m. or maybe half past. My dad was out for the evening, visiting a friend or coworker. I can't quite recall. He left me home, which was normal, as I worked odd hours. I was a small-time indie game developer back then, working freelance, coding and designing pixel art adventures in my bedroom. It was hit or miss, honestly, and I often worked late into the night. That evening, I decided to take a break and walk the dogs. Dogger, my golden retriever, was getting on in years, about 12. And if you're wondering, I named him that when I was just a kid, about 8 years old, and not very inventive with names. Leeroy was younger, a corgi mix with a quirky pattern of black and brown spots on predominantly white fur. He was only 4, energetic as all heck, and always looked up to Dogger as if he was a big brother. And Dogger loved it. The two were inseparable. The 3 of us had a routine. We would leave the house and stroll down the driveway, the dogs sniffing at the edges of the gravel and dirt where it met the long, weedy fields. Sometimes we'd make a couple of laps, walk all the way out to the end where the driveway meets the road, turn around, and head back to the house. The property line abutted a stretch of farmland on either side, but just beyond the road was a wall of tall trees that led into the woods. It wasn't a national forest, just a private woodland that went on for miles. And as I said, you could see the little glows of distant towns through those branches. Tiny pinpricks of light, especially where the leaves thinned out. There were a few old street lamps along the driveway, but none at the very end. Beyond those lights, it could get very dark. That night, after working a few hours hunched over my laptop, I had decided to give my eyes and mind a break. I got the dogs and went outside, where the moon was bright and clear overhead. The first lap down the driveway was perfectly normal. I remember Dogger moving slow and steady, tail wagging lazily. Meanwhile, Leeroy trotted around, ears perked up, occasionally barking at nothing like corgis do. We made it to the end of the road, looked around, and I even noticed how bright the moon was. Through the trees far away, I could see the soft glow of distant neighborhoods, or maybe the reflection of city lights off low clouds. Just a faint illumination that reassured me I wasn't in total wilderness. We turned around, walking back toward the house. Then we decided to do another lap. Not sure why I was so up for it. Maybe I needed to stretch my legs after a long coding session, or maybe the fresh air felt good. The second time down the driveway is when everything changed. I noticed it almost immediately as we approached the end of the driveway again. The forest, this time, was darker. But it wasn't just dark. It was black, and I mean solid black, an absolute absence of light, as though someone had painted over the gaps between the trees and branches with pitch. Usually, I could pick out those distant lights flickering through, or at least see a dim suggestion of depth between the trunks. But this time, it was like a giant slab of black had been placed at the tree line, sealing off any hint of what lay beyond. I paused at the end of the driveway, maybe 10 or 15 feet from where the gravel met the paved road. I glanced upward. The moon was still there, bright and full and beautiful, but no clouds. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks or adjusting to the light differently. But that wouldn't explain the dog's reactions. Dogger, who normally didn't spook easily, pulled backwards on his leash, whimpering low in his throat. Leeroy's hackles went up. He made this whining bark, stepping sideways, trying to drag me back. It was as if they both sensed something I couldn't see. I remember feeling this cold tingle run up my spine. The primal kind of fear that comes when your animals signal that something is very, very wrong, and we should all leave this place. I tried to coax them forward, but they simply wouldn't budge. In fact, Dogger slipped out of his collar. It was loose-fitting for comfort due to his old age, and bolted straight back towards the house. Leeroy followed him almost instantly, his leash going slack in my hand before I realized what even happened. They never did that, especially Dogger. He was old, but even at his age he was steady and obedient. For him to run, or heck, abandon me, was unthinkable. I stood there alone then, heart pounding, gazing at this unnaturally black section of forest. I should have followed the dogs immediately, but I was both curious and unsettled. I half convinced myself that maybe a low mist or smoke had drifted in. I even took a step forward, trying to get a better look, but no, it was sheer and utter darkness. And that is when I heard the breathing. My first assumption was distant machinery, like a large truck idling far away, or maybe a heavy tractor engine chugging softly in a field I couldn't see. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't mechanical. It rose and fell very slowly, huge and resonant, with a wetness to it that no machine could replicate. Inhale, exhale, exhale. Each breath was drawn and released in a manner that suggested unimaginable lungs. It sounded as if something massive, something alive, was standing right there, just beyond the end of the driveway, obscured by unnatural darkness. The dogs were gone. I was alone. I can't explain how much fear just gripped me then. I'm no hunter, no woodsman, but I know what animals sound like. A bear, even a large one, does not breathe like that. A moose or a deer doesn't stand upright, blocking out all light, or breathe with this slow, giant rhythm. I felt something watching me, something I couldn't see, but that definitely saw me. That's when my survival instincts kicked in, albeit clumsily. I turned and ran, sprinting a few steps, but then the thought flashed in my mind, never break into a run in front of a predator. That was something I'd read somewhere. Running triggers a chase response. I slowed down to a brisk walk, forcing my legs to move mechanically, my breathing ragged. The dogs were long gone, probably at the porch waiting to be let in. I listened, expecting to hear thundering steps coming from behind me or crashing branches. But nothing came. When I did dare to glance back over my shoulder, I saw the faint city lights again through the trees, like I should. The blackness had vanished. Whatever had been there was gone, or hiding. I made it back to the house, sweating down my neck. Dogger and Leeroy were waiting for me, panting nervously on the porch. I took them inside, locked the doors, and walked through every room, turning on every light I could find. My heart rate was still sky high. I tried to calm down by resuming my work, sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee. The dogs lay quietly now, perhaps reassured by the warmth and security of home. I told myself maybe I imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was tired, overworked. The lights don't always show perfectly well, after all. That portion of woods is quite dark. Maybe there was some big truck in the distance, going down a road not too far from us. Yeah, that's it, I told myself. About 45 minutes passed, enough time for me to nearly convince myself it was nothing. I was tinkering with some code, sipping coffee that had grown lukewarm, when Dogger and Leeroy suddenly started to go nuts. They barked and whined and scratched at the walls. Even old Dogger was completely frantic. Leeroy's barking was high-pitched, terrified. I stood up, heart in my throat, and was about to go to the window to see what set them off. And then I heard deep, resounding thumps. I'm not talking about gunshots or doors slamming. These were tremors, vibrations in the very earth. Each one made the windows rattle slightly. It was like hearing a giant's footsteps, one then another, slow and deliberate, as if something enormous circled the house. My skin went cold, and fear seized me so completely that I could barely breathe. I grabbed both dogs and led them to the den, a room that was at the center of the house with just one small window. I turned off all those lights, sat with them, and waited. The dogs continued to whine and scratch at me, trying to burrow behind my legs. I could hear the footsteps circling, crunching the gravel in the driveway, then stepping onto the grass. They were impossibly heavy, each one sending a slight vibration up through the floorboards. This went on for at least 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. I huddled there in the dark, every muscle tense, expecting at any moment for the walls around us to be torn down. Then it stopped. The footsteps stopped. It was like the thing had paused directly over the house. Silence followed, a silence so thick and tense I thought I might scream. I dared to raise my head and look toward the window. All I could see was blackness through it, as if something was blocking the entire frame. No moonlight, no glow from the outside lamps like I should be seeing. Just the same void I'd seen before. A moment later, the breathing started again, right outside the glass. Deep, slow, colossal inhalations and exhalations that fogged up the window. I could hear the faint hiss of breath condensing on the glass. A large oval of fog spread across the pane. That meant it was close. So close, it was practically pressing its face against the window. I could do nothing but sit there, clutching the dogs, trying not to make a sound. I closed my eyes, holding back tears. After another long while, the breathing faded. I waited, and eventually I mustered the courage to open my eyes. The window was clear again. Through it now, I could see the normal nighttime landscape, the moonlight on the fields, the faint outline of the trees in the distance. No monstrous silhouette, no impossible darkness. Everything was calm and quiet and utterly ordinary again. Still terrified, I stayed in the den with the dogs, huddled under a thick blanket. I didn't dare turn on the lights, nor did I dare to go to the front door. I just waited, breathing softly, my mind racing. An hour or so later, I heard my dad's car pull into the driveway. Even so, I stayed put. He came inside, seeing me and the dogs under a blanket in the dimly lit den, and let out a laugh. "What are you doing?" he asked, amused. I tried to explain what happened. I stammered about the darkness at the edge of the woods, the breathing, the footsteps, the window. He gave me a skeptical grin and shook his head. "You and your grandpa are nuts," he said, setting down his keys. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "He told you that story, didn't he? About the giant in the woods scaring lumberjacks and making people go missing? Those are just some Canadian tall tales he brought back. There's nothing out there." He laughed again and stepped into the kitchen. I wanted to argue to make him believe me, but I couldn't. There's no way to explain something like that any better than I already tried. In fact, the next morning I went to look for tracks. Nothing there. If it was really that big enough to make the earth itself rumble, why were there no footprints? Well, as you probably guessed, I hope I never see it again. I hope that night was a fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime brush with the unexplainable. Water hazard. From SurpriseSydney. I have an unconventional job, to say the least. I'm a professional golf ball diver. The title is pretty self-explanatory. I dive into lakes and ponds on golf courses to retrieve lost balls. It's tough, dirty work, but it pays surprisingly well. I have contracts with various courses that allow me to collect the balls, which they clean, repackage, and resell. For every ball I recover, I earn a fee, usually 13 to 18 cents a ball, depending on the arrangement. It may not sound like much at first, but when you're hauling in 3,000 to 4,000 balls a day, it adds up fast. The story I'm about to share happened a few years ago, during the height of COVID-19. Like so many others, I found myself struggling financially when the pandemic hit. Golf courses shut down during quarantine, which meant my work dried up overnight. Though the job pays well, I live pretty modestly, so even a short disruption in income was hard on my bank account. After some time without work, I'm ashamed to admit I turned to night hawking, which is illegal diving on courses. Being well known in my local golf community, I knew better than to trespass on active courses. Getting caught could destroy my career and reputation. Instead, I targeted abandoned courses. Most folks don't realize just how many failed golf courses are out there. Some get sold off and turned into housing developments. Others are simply left to overgrow and fade back into the wilderness. I'd been in the business long enough to know where many of these forgotten greens were. I had even worked on a few before they went under. In the dead of night, I'd drive out to one of these courses, fill a couple of bags with balls, and head home. These places were gold mines, untouched for years with piles of balls just waiting to be scooped up from the bottom of the ponds. It was almost too easy. After some time of alternating between 3 courses, I decided to tackle one I'd been avoiding. This one had been abandoned for much longer than the others, and I'd stayed away for good reason. Not only was it completely overgrown, but it bordered a stretch of swampland that made it difficult to access. This particular course was built in the middle of nowhere. It had been designed as an exclusive retreat for VIP clientele. After just a decade or so, the course went under, and the swamp aggressively reclaimed its territory. That night, pulling up to what was left of the road leading to the course, I was greeted by a row of orange, water-filled barricades, clearly placed to prevent exactly what I was about to do. This road was the only way in or out of the golf course, and the course itself was still a mile ahead. I already knew about the barricades, though. I'd scouted the area a few days earlier and came prepared with a gorilla cart to haul my equipment in the rest of the way. Piece by piece, I lifted my cart and equipment over the barricades, loading everything into the wagon and starting toward the course. The pavement was fractured and broken, resembling a shattered mirror more than a road. From those cracks, tall weeds and clumps of grass sprouted skyward. The road was lined with busted street lamps, their frames tangled with vines. The night wasn't as dark as usual. It was nearly a full moon, and the sky was clear. My hat light, combined with the dim glow of the moon, illuminated my surroundings wonderfully. After about half an hour of hiking down the road, I reached the dilapidated parking lot. It was a flat gray plain, stark against the tall greens and browns of the grass and weeds encroaching from all sides. Directly across from where I stood, on the far side of the lot, was the old clubhouse. Its wood was darkened and rotted, with most of the windows shattered. Portions of the roof had collapsed, and one section had a tree growing through it, the branches stretching and trying to reach the stars, it seemed like. I had worked here briefly as a greenskeeper many years back. While my memory of the layout was hazy, some parts stuck with me, like the large pond near Hole 5. That pond was my destination for the night. Back when the course was maintained, it would have been about a 25-minute walk from the clubhouse to the pond. But with the swamp reclaiming the fairways, I knew the trek would take at least twice as long, especially with my cart. I headed toward the left side of the parking lot, stopping in front of the dense wall of foliage. The thought of the haul ahead of me wasn't exactly thrilling. Exhaling through my nose, I put my shoulder forward, parting the tall weeds as I made my way into the green, disappearing behind it. Navigating to hole 5 was more difficult than I'd anticipated. The overgrowth was nearly as tall as me, forcing me to stop frequently and stand on my tiptoes to get my bearings. The thick vegetation slowed me down, but after about 40 minutes of trudging, I finally came across a weathered and splintered wooden sign that read, Hole 5. Someone had spray painted the word, "but" over it, so now the sign read, "But Hole 5. That made me smile. It was a delightfully brief distraction from my exhausting trek. Approaching the edge of the pond, I paused to take in the scene. The moon was overhead, casting a silvery hue across the water. It was quite a serene scene. I took a moment to don my gear and I stepped into the water. As I slowly waded in, lowering myself further, a sudden explosion of squealing bullfrogs burst out, leaping in all directions and startling a pair of herons into flight. I continued out a little farther before diving beneath the surface. Carefully, I began to methodically scan the pond's bottom with my hands, feeling for the balls scattered below. Although I did have a headlamp, it was practically useless here. It's the only way to do it, day or night. Most ponds are black water, where visibility is non-existent, so everything must be done by touch. It didn't take long to realize this was the jackpot. Ball after ball filled my hands as I worked. Progress was slower than usual due to considerable debris on the bottom, but it hardly mattered. The abundance of balls made every effort worthwhile. After some time, I'd filled one bag to capacity. Resurfacing, I grabbed a second bag and ventured farther out before diving under again. As I reached the bottom and began feeling along the muck, my hand struck something hard and covered with lumps. Curious, I followed its contours, tracing a curved edge that led to a larger, smooth surface. After a moment of exploration, it hit me. I had found a golf cart. I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it. How someone managed to get it this far out into the pond was beyond me. As I continued to comb around my unexpected discovery, I suddenly felt a rush of movement pass close by. It was fast and massive. I had been doing this long enough to know what a big fish felt like. This wasn't that. This was something entirely different. There was no doubt in my mind, it was an alligator. I knew this was bound to happen. Alligators are common inhabitants of ponds on operational courses, so encountering one out here was almost inevitable. While dangerous, gators typically won't attack underwater unless they feel cornered or provoked. This meant I needed to stay cautious, but didn't face any immediate threat. However, surfacing was another matter entirely. That's when the risk of an attack becomes very real. I pushed off the golf cart and sank back into the muck, resuming my search for balls. My limbs felt stiffer now, my head on a constant swivel. The silt-choked dark water swallowed the beam of my headlamp, limiting visibility to just a few inches. Not being able to see was one thing, but it's always worse when you know there's a gator nearby. The worst part wasn't even the knowing, it was accidentally touching them. Now that's a real poo-your-pants moment, and it had happened to me more than once in my career. Running my fingers along the bottom, I kept bumping into hard, lumpy objects. Every time I jerked my hand back, only to realize it was just a log or some debris, not a gator. Still, every so often, I could feel something massive gliding past me in the dark, just at arm's length. After some time, I managed to fill another small bag with golf balls and decided to call it a night. But I had to be careful. I didn't like how curious this gator was acting, so I planned to surface as close to the edge as possible to minimize my time exposed at the surface. Swimming in the direction I thought was land, I moved cautiously for a few minutes. Confident I was close, I resurfaced. As my head broke through the water and my vision adjusted, I saw I was right, but I hadn't swum far enough. While I was close, there was still some distance to cover before I'd made it back to land. I began to paddle my way over, excited by the night's turn of events. This place really was a gold mine. Between this pond and the others in the area, I'd be rolling in inventory. I was already planning my second trip in my head when it happened. Out of nowhere, something struck me under the water. My outstretched legs, kicking behind me, were suddenly swept downward in one swift motion. The sensation was so foreign that I didn't understand what was happening until I was completely submerged. My only thought was I need more air. I fought against the force dragging me down, managing to break the surface just long enough to gulp in a lungful of air before being wrenched back under. In those moments, I remember marveling at how impossibly strong this thing was. Every kick and pull of my legs felt useless, as if I were fighting gravity itself. Desperately, I reached for the dive knife strapped to my waist. I knew stabbing the top of an alligator wouldn't do much, but the eyes were a vulnerable spot. If I could feel along its face, I might find an eye to jab and make it let me go. My hand found the knife handle, and I quickly unsheathed it. Contorting my upper body downward, I reached toward my legs. I felt along my leg toward the pressure clamped around my calf. As my hands explored what had me, I touched something stiff and lumpy, the bumpy texture of an alligator's skin. But I didn't feel a snout or teeth. Instead, I felt 4 thick, bumpy protrusions. It wasn't a mouth that had me. It was hands. Before I could process this horrifying realization, I grabbed the arm gripping me and yanked at it. Instantly, my legs were jerked in another direction. The arm wrenched free of my grasp as the thing reacted violently to my touch. My body slammed into the bottom of the pond, kicking up a massive cloud of silt. Brown specks swirled everywhere, blinding me as I lay pinned in the muck. The thing shifted its grip, releasing one of my legs and grabbing higher around my thigh. Then it did the same with the other leg. Finally, its hands clamped around my waist, slowly climbing its way up my body. Its weight pressed down on me, pinning me deep into the muddy bottom as I struggled to hold my breath. I felt its fingers clawing at my face, one hand pressing against my forehead, while the other gripped my mouth, pulling with force. It was trying to pry my mouth open. Panic surged through me. In a frenzy, I stabbed with my knife over and over again. Each strike found its mark, but the blade barely penetrated. Its hide was too thick, like stabbing into solid wood. The knife would go in just a fraction before stopping. Desperate, I changed the angle of my swing and drove the knife with all my strength. This time, the blade sank in. The reaction was immediate. In a sudden, violent burst of movement, the thing released me. Its weight vanished, and my body began to float upward, lifting off the bottom as I kicked frantically for the surface. I burst through the water, gasping for air. I quickly gathered my bearings, and I began to swim for land. Exhaustion weighed me down with every stroke, but I pushed forward. Reaching the edge of the pond, I clawed my way through a dense patch of cattails, too weak to stand. I dragged myself up the slight embankment, and I collapsed onto my back, completely spent. No matter how much my chest heaved, it wasn't enough air. My heart raced, my lungs burned, and I couldn't move another inch. Lying there, I stared out over the pond, terrified, waiting for the thing to burst from the murky water and drag me back under. But instead, across the pond, I saw movement. something was crawling out of the water. It was big. As it emerged, I realized it wasn't just crawling. It rose onto 2 legs, an enormous tail dragging behind it. Water streamed from its body as it lumbered out of the pond. Then it stopped. It turned in my direction, and my chest stopped mid-heave as its gaze found me. For a brief moment, we stared at one another. And then I saw the handle of my knife protruding from the creature's midsection. Without a sound, it turned away and disappeared into the swamp. If you asked me what I encountered that night, I wouldn't have an answer for you. Honestly, I don't want one. I truly believe knowing the truth would shatter my sanity. I think about that night all the time, about the things that might be out there. Creatures lurking on the fringes of our world, reclaiming the places we've abandoned. They make their homes in dark places forgotten by the rest of us. There's a reason our kind avoid certain woods, shun certain mountains, fear certain waters, and dread the dark. It's because that's where the monsters live. Wow, some pretty freaky stories tonight. Do you think maybe that last tale was about the ghost of a giant? Maybe that old lady in the plant nursery was just one teed-off florist getting her revenge by strangling some lilies. Who knows? Thanks for tuning in this week for more Tales from the Break Room. Help us grow by following us and reviewing us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or you can listen on YouTube. Just go on YouTube and search for Darkness Prevails. Send us your scary work stories at eeriecast.com/submit. And leave us a comment about some cool ideas you have for Tales from the Break Room merch, because I just realized I've completely failed to make any. You can clock out until next time, but please do come back for another coffee on me. Well, half off.